conversation. Oh, there we go. Okay. We feel at home. This is like the legislature.
Yep.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm State Rep Kristen McCarthy-Bahey. I have the privilege of representing this district, the 133rd, which includes Fairfield and Bridgeport. And tonight we have a wonderful panel with us. And I'm very honored and pleased to be working together in partnership with my two amazing colleagues who will introduce themselves, and then our panelists will introduce themselves, and we will get right into the discussion.
Good evening. For those of you who don't know me, I'm State Representative Sarah Kitt. I represent the 134th District, which is sort of Greenfield Hills, a little bit of Southport, up through Lake Mohegan. I also have part of Trumbull.
I'm State Representative Jen Leeper. I represent the 132nd District, which is entirely within Fairfield.
And we'll have our panelists introduce themselves and then turn it back to Rep. Leeper.
So sorry. My name is Matt Fulda. I'm the Executive Director of the Connecticut Metropolitan Council of Governments, MetroCog, the regional planning organization for the Greater Bridgeport region, which includes Fairfield.
My name is Tom Corsillo. I'm a member of the Fairfield Plan and Zoning Commission for the last 3 years and currently serve as chair of the commission.
Hi, I'm Emmeline Harrigan. I'm the planning director here for the town of Fairfield.
And I'm Rebecca Auger. I am the leader of the Office of Responsible Growth at the Connecticut Office of Policy and Management.
Well, we are very thrilled that you are here with us. And I want to acknowledge and recognize our first select person, Christine Vitale, who has joined us. And we want to thank you very much for being with us, as well as our selectman, or select person, excuse me. We have changed the charter. Marcy Spolier, and we have Michelle McCabe, who is our RTM majority leader. Jonathan Delgado, also on the TP&Z. Who else am I missing? Oh, Eileen, another, and John, and Craig. We have a few other RTM members. Did I miss any other?
Bob.
Oh, and Bob Elwanger from our Board of Finance. So there are a number of elected folks here with us in the room. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back to Rep. Leeper.
And I also just want to let folks know, if you have questions, there are cards in the back. You can write them down and hand them to Jonathan, who has volunteered to be the keeper of the questions. So as I'm sure you've heard, this is a very large piece of legislation with lots of different components. And so we thought it might be helpful to just do a very quick summary. And then for the portions of the bill that are most often discussed, we will be having much deeper conversation around those. But this is just sort of a high level summary for your reference. So the first portion of the bill is a first-time home buyers savings program for individuals and employers to contribute. Single filers who earn up to $125,000 a year and joint filers who earn up to $250,000 a year are eligible to participate in that program. The largest component of the bill, and probably what our discussion will focus on tonight, is the housing growth plans. Fairfield has until 2029 to come up with that housing growth plan. Also within that provision of the bill, it repeals the fair share portion of the law, which is something that has often been discussed and was controversial, and that's been completely repealed from Connecticut state statute. We lower the 830G moratorium threshold if we adopt priority housing development zones. There's quite a bit of detail in there. TOD zone qualify as a priority housing zone. Housing growth grant program that enables more grant dollars to come to the community for various infrastructure needs. There's the adoption of the transit-oriented development zone. Again, that's an option communities can choose to opt into. The minimum parking requirements is another provision of this bill. I believe there's been a lot of discussion that we will talk more about. The middle housing development grant program, so offering grants for doing middle housing, which is that smaller scale density. There's a pilot program for awarding grants for housing authorities and nonprofits and CHFA to acquire housing units and put deed affordability on them. So keeping sort of your naturally occurring affordable housing deeded affordable. That's a pilot program running in Stamford and New Haven. And then also there's various other grant programs for school construction, water quality protection program, a statewide wastewater capacity study, and then also an open choice voucher program, which connects our school open choice program with enabling families to live in the community their child goes to school in. So that was a lot, and it's a really high level overview, but I thought that sort of information might be helpful as we launch into a deeper conversation.
Before we do, we as the reps will take turns asking questions of our panelists. We're really here to facilitate the conversation because they are the experts and they are the people who, in some cases, were very involved in the conversation around the legislation and drafting, and in other cases, very involved in how we are going to be implementing this. I did also want to recognize Dan Onofrio from the BRBC who has joined us, and we're glad to have you as well. So. And Rob Blanchard, another RTM member. So it's great to have such a great turnout. So with that, I'll turn it back to Jen.
All right, so here is the first question. Why do we have a shortage of housing units? With so much recent building and so many recent projects, don't we have enough?
And I don't know, Bernie, did we want to share the slides or did we not want to share the slides?
Yes.
So I just prepared a couple of very brief slides. I've been with the town of Fairfield for just over 8 years. I became the planning director in April. And we thankfully just recently passed our update to our plan of conservation and development, which is our guiding document that helps us understand from a policy perspective where we want to focus development, where we want to focus conservation, resiliency, efforts related to increased flood risk for the town, et cetera, et cetera. And that's dictated by state statute. We have to update it every 10 years. But one of the things that I thought was just really representative as to why we really have to talk about housing within the town of Fairfield, and which, by the way, we've been doing since the mid-'80s. We've had an affordable housing plan before it was required by state law. We started this back in the 80s. We're now on to our third affordable housing plan here in Fairfield. And a lot of the work that was done with the affordable housing plan is because housing prices have really increased precipitously. So when we started doing our planning process for our POCD back in 2017, the median home sales price was about $578,000. We had 61,000 residents, 10,000 plus school kids, a median age of 41, and that's with 2 universities in town, 20,000 households and 21,000 housing units with a median income of $122,000. Flash forward to our recent adoption of our POCD, and the median home sales price has gone up to $738,000. And that's just based on data that's derived from the American Community Survey, which is based on census data that's updated. If you actually looked at Realtor.com, it lists our median home sales price as $1.4 million. So that's really, that's really significantly unaffordable for folks who are starting out, folks who may want to downsize, whether based on choice or life changes, like they lose a spouse, they get divorced. So we know that we need more diverse housing choices in Fairfield, even for folks who temporarily need a different type of housing solution and then want to go back to being within the home ownership marketplace. But it's very expensive to do that. So I'll just go to the next slide. I did actually look at one of the things that we also understand based on the planning that we do is that households have changed quite a bit. So 59% of all US households contain 1 or 2 people in them. That's 65% actually in the town of Fairfield. So a majority of our households are households without children in them. So we really need to look at different housing types because the majority, if we go to the next slide, the majority of housing within the US generally, and this is representative of Fairfield as well, 39% of the housing stock that we have is at least 3 bedrooms. And almost 17% of that is 4 bedrooms, and almost 5% of that is over 4 bedrooms. So we really have a lack of housing within the marketplace that actually meets 1 to 2 person households. In Fairfield, if we go to the next slide, this is listings that I pulled yesterday morning. We have, for example, on High Street, what we would consider a starter home. So this is an 1,100 square foot, 2-bed, 3-bath home. The sales price is $650,000, right? And so you can see that for these homes that most people would kind of look at as either starter or places where, maybe that, of the 72 listings that are available, where we have 21,000 housing units in town, 19,000 of those are home ownership units. We only have 72 listings, which is part of what drives the high cost, because we have a demand for these homes, but not enough supply. So we need to kind of figure out how to open this up a little bit. The next slide I also pulled listings for rentals yesterday, and there were 169 listings that were available. But keep in mind that for us, those listings represent rental properties within Fairfield and rental properties also within the Black Rock area. It kind of pulls from both of those. And we look at rents that are, for a 1-bedroom, for example, if we're looking at Fairfield Station Lofts downtown, that's $3,700 for a 1-bedroom. If we're looking closer to Black Rock, Creekline starts at about $2,600 for a 1-bedroom. So we're really looking at very high prices for rental units available as well, because we don't have enough in the marketplace to decrease the pricing for those. And right now we're seeing about, I know there's been some conversation about all the approvals that have recently come through plan and zoning. Not a lot of those have actually been constructed as of yet. So right now, our vacancy rate, which has historically hovered around 4% for our rental properties, right now it's at about 7%. But that's because in my conversations with those developers, they've had a lot of people who bought homes before the end of the year and kind of paid penalties to get out of their leases. So we don't have a lot of supply. So the goal for us, both in conjunction with the Plan and Zoning Commission and our Affordable Housing Committee, is to really figure out how do we diversify and add to that supply that's much needed within the town of Fairfield.
Yes, so many people have talked about this bill as requiring a certain number of units being needed and to be built, that need to be built within Fairfield and with our communities. I was hoping you could talk to what kind of numbers or goals are actually part of this bill, and how are those numbers determined, and who's involved in this process?
Let me start with.
Sure. Yeah, you want to start with the state?
Transition? Sure. So there's nothing in this legislation that requires the construction of a certain number of units. There are several types of numbers that are required of the state and COGS to develop and to make recommendations around goals that form the basis of the housing growth plans. So I'll start with what the state is responsible for, and specifically OPM is developing a 10-year needs number for the entire state. And we interpret that to be very broad and not focused necessarily on affordable units, but all units, because we're talking about needs of affordability, adequacy, and accessibility, really. And then those numbers are to be focused into 10-year growth target numbers. So we interpret that to be really what's feasible to achieve. Again, not necessarily a construction number, but what's feasible to achieve to help address those needs in a 10-year period. And those numbers have to be prepared at a statewide level and at a regional planning level. So for Matt's region of Greater Bridgeport. And then from there, the COGS take over and develop affordable housing numbers.
Yeah, so from the state numbers, and as Rebecca has talked previously, it's kind of, we're envisioning it kind of like an inverted triangle, where the state number is a 10-year needs assessment, and it kind of whittles itself down to a regional goal and then municipal goals kind of from that regional goal. I think it's important to know, as Rebecca mentioned, that the law itself has no mandate to build. It's the goal is in order to plan for how to possibly accommodate these types of units within various municipalities across the state. So what the COGs are going to do in coordination with OPM is work on kind of the state and regional numbers. And then at the COG level, we are, for those who don't know, the council governments, we are created and governed by our board of directors, which is the chief elected official for the municipalities that make up our region. For select person Vitale and the other chief elected officials in the MetroCog region make up my board. So we will work with our board as well as the planning staff, Emmeline and her counterparts in the other municipalities in our region to look at the kind of the regional goal that comes from the state number and then understand how to separate that out to each municipality based on a number of factors that are included in the bill. But also other local factors that may not be explicitly stated in the bill either. And I think it's important that when we talk about how that's going to be developed, it is not the COG telling the town what to do. It is a collaborative effort between the COG staff, municipal staff, and the chief elected officials, planning and zoning staff in each of the towns, or planning and zoning commissions in the towns, to understand how we can get to a number that we can plan for and we can address this both affordability and accessibility issue that we face in housing across the state of Connecticut. I think it's really important. There's been some discussion that the COG is just going to tell the towns what to do. That's not the case. We work very collaboratively with all of our municipal members, with the chief elected officials, with the planning staff, and we will continue that throughout this process to ensure that there is a collaborative discussion happening, and that when we get to those final numbers, my hope is that we will have enough discussions at the local level, at the regional level, that those numbers are not going to be seen as a mandate, but as a way for all of us collectively to move forward in a more beneficial way for everyone in the state.
Thank you. I suspect we'll have more conversation about that in the questions, but I also wanted to recognize two other RTM members who joined us, Drew Georgiadis and Emma Barron, who are here as well. So this one is probably also for Matt and Rebecca. We've talked a little bit about, and we've heard about these housing growth plans. And Rep. Leeper, you said in the beginning that that's really a core kind of the conversation. So what is a housing growth plan? And Emmeline mentioned that we've been doing planning in Fairfield for a while. We have an affordable housing plan. How does that all fit together? So if you can help us understand what that is. Great.
Thanks. The legislation, Special Act 25-1, also known as House Bill 8002, does require housing growth plans at the municipal level. Municipalities have the option at their discretion to opt into a regional plan that will be coordinated with, but again, collaboratively drafted at the regional COG level for those municipalities that decide to opt in. You also have the ability, as in the law, that it's explicitly a municipal plan. So if the town wants to do the plan on their own, they are more than able to do so. I think it's important that, as Emmeline mentioned, the town of Fairfield has been doing affordable housing plans since well before it was mandated by the state. And I think it's very commendable that was happening. The one thing that this law does do is the previous affordable housing plans that were made law by 830J is the statute, are repealed based on this new law, and the housing growth plans have replaced those. So the 830J plan that the town has done previously is no longer required, and the new housing growth plan is what takes its place. Those housing growth plans are going to be drafted in a very similar manner to what Fairfield has always done, with public engagement, public input, public comment, and then eventually adoption at the local level and potentially at the regional level as well. But I think it's important for the town of Fairfield specifically, and really everyone, to know that this is not a plan that is kind of new. It's similar to the 830J plan, but it's really focusing on those affordability goals. But I think you can also bring in aspects of general housing accessibility. As Emmeline talked about, affordability is certainly a major issue, but some of the affordability issues come from the fact that there is a lack of inventory and a supply and demand issue. And our hope at the regional level is to help coordinate and collaborate with our municipalities to understand how we can better address all of the accessibility issues when it comes to housing, not Obviously, affordability is a key component of that, but really all the potential opportunities for housing that can make some of the supply and demand issues a little bit less than they are currently.
I would just add to that under 830J, the previous affordable housing plans, there wasn't a lot of guidance within the statutes as to what those plans needed to contain. This law does prescribe several elements that need to be contained within the housing growth plans, and OPM is tasked with developing guidance on some of the data that will be collected from municipalities, and not just data points like certificates of occupancy and that sort of thing, but also on your performance in implementing these housing growth plans. We are to collect that information on an annual basis because they open up access to some new funding opportunities. And so there's a lot more clarity into what should be included in these plans, and OPM will be offering further guidance around that in the coming year as well.
Rebecca, thank you for that. And I'm also going to just remind all of us, myself included, to use our outside voices since the microphones are picking up for the recording, but maybe those of you in the back, I don't know. Emma, are you able to hear us okay? Good, thumbs up. I'm just going to ask a quick follow-up off script that to Rebecca. Those of us the three of us who are working at the Capitol are very familiar with OPM, as actually our other panelists are. Can you just say a little bit about what OPM is and what your office is within OPM, just to give folks a little bit more of a sense of, what perspective you're bringing?
Sure. So OPM is the Office of Policy and Management, and most people know it as the agency that helps develop the budget for the state. But there are several divisions within OPM, and we work closely with the governor's office on many policy matters. And I'm within the intergovernmental division. And so we work very closely with councils of governments and municipalities on a variety of issues, including taxation issues. My Office of Responsible Growth, however, is very focused on land use, conservation, and development issues. And so we write the state's plan of conservation and development, which we just got adopted last year. For the first time in a while. And we have been a part of the housing discussions for the past several years.
Thank you.
So I think what most people want to know is, what will the town do at the local level to address these targets? And what will this mean for Fairfield? So I think maybe Tom and Emmeline, since you are our most local folks.
Yeah, so Emmeline mentioned our POCD that we recently adopted. That's our Plan of Conservation and Development. And I think in my experience before being part of the Plan and Zoning Commission, anytime I've put together a plan, it started with having a goal or an outcome that we know we're working toward. And traditionally in developing and adopting these POCDs, I think that's what's been lacking, is that sort of goal. And so I think these targets that we're going to be receiving will be really useful in helping to provide some guidance to the POCDs, these 10-year plans that we already adopt. The POCD that we adopted was the result of, I believe, a 7-year process that included public hearings, community vision sessions, meetings of different boards and committees. And so it was a really collaborative process to develop a document over a long period of time. And really what it includes is a series of recommendations, things that the town can consider, not just with regards to housing, but on a number of areas. And when it comes to housing, the POCD that we adopted already identified a need to create capacity for diverse housing options. So it's already aligned in that regard with the intent of this legislation. And so I think this is really going to help us figure out, okay, we need to go through all of these recommendations that we've identified and put into this POCD. Now we have some structure and we have a sense of what are we actually working toward, because there's a lot in there. There's a lot to get through over the course of 10 years. So I think this is really going to be helpful to us in figuring out how to prioritize all of the different recommendations that we have to consider.
I would just add to that we over time, we've done a lot of planning already. You can see that in some of the development that's occurred in conjunction with the opening of the Fairfield Black Rock train station. So there was a large TOD study that was done that originally, transit-oriented development study that was originally envisioned 1 million square feet of office at that train station. Time passed, trends changed for what we could reasonably expect for economic development in that area. And so there was a new study that was done, and we really focused on mixed use in the corridor. And we can see, I think, some of the fruitfulness of some of that planning through changes in our regulatory structure, through our zoning regulations that have allowed for the trademark development, which has Sally's on the ground floor to be developed, the Alto development, which has Esh on the ground floor, and the dog daycare, for example. So it really kind of transformed what the expectation is for those folks who are going to develop in these corridors. My hope is, and in the outreach that we did, folks love Fairfield's downtown, but they wish that other areas that in our commercial corridors felt more like Fairfield's downtown. So there is a desire for a change in our zoning regulations to, instead of have auto-oriented business corridors, to reinvigorate some of our business corridors, which are dealing with aging building stock, that when those are ready for redevelopment, which I think is coming very soon, that those are closer to feel and flavor and walkability and vibrancy like Fairfield's downtown. So that's some of the work that we have to focus on within the next coming years in order to accommodate those changes where people want some of that walkability closer to where they live.
And the only thing I'll just add, I think from a process perspective, because the question is, what are we going to actually do to address these targets? We ultimately are going to have to implement specific regulation changes to our zoning regulations. And that's going to be done through the same process that we would have gone through prior to this legislation. And so each potential zoning regulation amendment that we're going to consider is going to have a public hearing. Public will have a chance to weigh in, to speak, to write in their testimony. And so it's going to follow a similar process. And again, because this is all going to be based on a series of tactics that we've already looked at and put into a plan within the last month. I think it's going to be a lot of things that are familiar to people because they're things that we've been talking about.
Thank you.
So thank you for that. This next question, I think I'm going to aim towards Rebecca and Matt. I've talked to a lot of residents here in Fairfield, and I think we all can agree we have some amazing, beautiful natural resources here in town. And a lot of people are concerned about how are we going to preserve open space and protect our environment under this bill. We've got one of our youngest environmental advocates here in the audience. So could you help us understand what is considered developable land inventory, and what is OPM's role, and how will they work with COGS and municipalities on these projects?
Sure. So the housing growth plans, as one of the many elements that are required, include a developable land inventory. And so that's to be developed by municipality and or COG. OPM's role in the developable land inventory is simply to provide statewide data sets and tools and resources that municipalities can use in conjunction with your own local data to help identify developable land opportunities. Because while the law defines what is meant by developable land, there's a lot of values and assumptions embedded in that. I mean, it talks about redevelopment opportunities, but how you go about trying to identify redevelopment opportunities depends on the data available to you. The approach that you use might depend on your community values. And so when you talk about protecting open space, there are a lot of lands that are excluded from the definition of developable land, anything with protection or topographic issues or wetlands and those sorts of things. But there's also opportunity to incorporate local information and data. For example, if your new POCD has areas targeted for conservation, there's no reason why that can't be a portion of the developable land inventory. OPM through the GIS office will be developing the mapping standards, but we will not be defining what data sets have to be used.
Yeah, I think that's an important piece of this is the developable land inventory, as Rebecca mentioned, is required as part of the housing growth plan, either to be developed locally at a municipality level or collectively with support from the council governments. And as Rebecca mentioned, this as part of the plan, as part of the individual municipalities' ability to kind of identify where they would like to target their growth, as you have already done in Fairfield with your recently passed POCD. That's the type of information that will be used to inform that developable land inventory. I know one of the things in your POCD is looking at kind of these resilience areas. We know that the storm coming this weekend, coastal storms, obviously, thankfully not a hurricane coming up the coast, but are causing issues in coastal communities across Connecticut, Fairfield specifically. So we obviously understand that, you're not going to want to focus a lot of development and create a developable land that's within the 100-year floodplain that is going to have significant resilience issues. So all those, there are some carve outs in the statute itself for conservation land for already preserved open space, but you still have a lot of flexibility at the local level and at the regional level to kind of take the characteristics on the ground and make sure that the developable land that is being proposed is congruent with and meets with the appetite of each municipality. So it's not every piece of land that's not currently developed is going to be thrown into this inventory, and there's going to be an opportunity to develop every single blade of grass that exists in the town of Fairfield. That's not the case, and we are going to work, as I said before, very collaboratively, as we always do, with our municipal partners to help identify those developable land opportunities. As Rebecca mentioned, it's not necessarily taking undeveloped land and putting development on it. Some of it could be redevelopment. Some of it could be, brownfield cleanup in certain places to redevelop opportunities. So it doesn't have to necessarily be brand new open space that we're going to put a building on. And I think that's really important because that has been discussed as, we're going to kind of destroy all of the natural beauty that exists in municipalities. And that's certainly not the intent, nor I think will be the result of this legislation.
So I'll take a moment to just do an advertisement for the CT Geodata portal. So GIS, it's a great way to visualize data. This is the office that will work in conjunction. It's geodata.ct.gov. This is open to everyone to take a look. There's lots of wonderful open data on the website. So the next question is something Tom talked about and something we all talk about a lot, which is that the people of the community know the communities best in terms of the issues. But sometimes, we don't always have the full perspective, but we want to make sure that communities have a voice. So how will this bill allow local residents to have their voices heard, to have their input be considered? Oftentimes we hear the word local control, which is maybe not my favorite term, but it is my favorite, that we want to make sure that we're including the voices of the community. So if you can, Tom and Emmeline, if you can touch on that.
I mean, I think the biggest change is that this legislation really shifts when public input comes into play from the project level to the planning level, which I think is really helpful. We have, again, I keep talking about the POCD, but during the course of the 7 years that we took to plan that was a planning exercise, and there was significant public input, and it came from a really broad cross-section of Fairfielders who were talking about their aspirations for the town, what they want to see, not just down the block from them, but in our downtowns, in our public, all our commercial corridors, our public spaces. And that is really helpful input to receive. And I think, again, what this does is shift where the input is coming into play to that planning stage, where I think we're going to end up getting input from a broader cross-section of Fairfield than we end up getting at the project level, where really what we're hearing from is a small slice of folks who live immediately adjacent to a property. Their feedback is really important, but I think it's when we're talking about where we're going as a town overall, it's really important to get that feedback from really everyone across town.
I do think too, with project review, it doesn't eliminate standards. and requirements, right? Those are still implicit in looking at a development, making sure that any concerns are reviewed at the staff level as well as by your elected plan and zoning commission, and that those are, really clearly defined within our zoning regulations. I will also say that we also already have light middle density within town. That's an as of right. Somebody applies in the online portal, for example, for duplexes within town, for up to fourplexes within town. And those are not public hearings. Those aren't even something that goes before our plan and zoning commission. So, I think we have a history of allowing for more diverse, things that are more diverse than just single family homes as an as of right approval within town. And I think, we looked at what those standards were. We understand what those envelopes are. And it's a very similar type of process to making sure that we are defining what that criteria is so that these reviews and approvals, they're consistent with what we're hoping to achieve within town.
And I think it's important to also, not everyone understands what as of right means. I see a lot of misconception about that. As of right does not mean there are no zoning regulations or requirements. It just refers to what a project that conforms with the existing zoning regulations and doesn't require additional discretionary approval. And so an as of right project has to comply with the zoning regulations. And as a town, we have the ability to work on those regulations, to change them if we think they need to be changed, to adjust our standards. And when we're talking about adjusting our zoning regulations, again, that's another opportunity for public input.
Thank you. This next question sort of talks about our quality of life here in Fairfield. I think a lot of people want to know how this is going to impact our infrastructure and traffic. We hear that everyone feels like traffic has increased in the past few years. How is this bill going to affect that? And this one's for, I would say, Emmeline and Matt.
Sorry.
It's, I think that we've had a couple of large developments already be constructed. Anchorage is a prime example just north of downtown. That's 90 units just north of downtown across from Ludlow. And it hasn't been impactful from a traffic perspective. We've had other multifamily buildings also be constructed without being impactful to neighborhoods. So I think that, the one thing that I always try to kind of talk through to people is Fairfield BlackRock used to be a factory that employed 5,000 to 6,000 people, and they arrived all at the same time on shift, right? Residential acts very differently. So everybody works at a different place. Some people work from home. And so you don't have people trying to clock in at exactly the same time. So residential trips are very dispersed throughout a day. Somebody has a 45-minute commute, somebody has a 5-minute commute. So, I think in terms of what we're going to see moving forward, even in our commercial corridors, economic development is going to include housing across the country. And Fairfield is representative of what's happening with economic development trends across the country. But again, I think what we have found is for example, I know there's been concern about some of the parking regulations. What we have found is 1.25 to 1.5 parking spaces per unit seems to work for our developments. I will say for Trademark, we required way too much parking for that. They have an open parking lot that they lease to commuters that they don't actually use for their general operations. So we have historically required too much parking. The developments that are going in we have found that once they're actually built, there's not a huge traffic impact. Even though I know that that's one of the primary concerns when we see these under review.
Yeah, I would building off of Emmeline's comments, I think MetroCog, as a regional planning agency, we also act as a metropolitan planning organization, which is a federal transportation planning region. So we do a lot of transportation work. I think one of the things about this bill that allows municipalities to kind of define those areas that they want to see development in is it allows the town to be intentional as well about where those developments occur. The law itself has some guidance in that in terms of kind of focusing on those areas with transit access. So that's one of the things to Emmeline's point about the trademark having probably too much parking, because it's really close to the train station. And a lot of people that live there chose to live there because they can walk to the train station and get to their place of employment. And then also kind of doubling down on having kind of mixed use areas where you have housing and other opportunities for people to work within close proximity, to Emmeline's point, also reduces the amount of trips that are leaving and coming to a specific development at a specific time. I would say, the question from Representative Kitt regarding kind of traffic increase over the last few years, I will say that's probably true. We have seen, we keep track of the volumes on 95 on a regular basis for the work that we do kind of just generally. Post-COVID, we had during COVID, just after COVID, a pretty precipitous downfall in the average daily trips on 95 and throughout our communities. We saw that kind of start to come back in 2022, 2023. We have now reached or exceeded kind of our regular average daily trips on 95. And one of the things that we have talked about through a lot of our planning work with the town of Fairfield is that Fairfield, unfortunately, has become kind of a choke point on 95, especially 95 South in the AM peak time. So a lot of folks are getting off at Fairfield Avenue in Bridgeport and coming through Fairfield to get back on 95 further south and make their way to further places south, Westport, Stamford, Norwalk. Connecticut DOT right now is undergoing a study, a planning environmental linkages study, which is kind of the first step in large infrastructure projects. And they're looking specifically at the 95 corridor from Bridgeport all the way through Fairfield. So while I understand the traffic concerns, there is a lot of work going on both within the town of Fairfield. We've done a lot of corridor traffic planning work with the town of Fairfield, but also larger on a regional basis with Connecticut DOT, looking at kind of how to make 95 operationally perform better and hopefully reduce some of that traffic that's using Fairfield as a cut through, so that you as residents can have less traffic and can get to the places you need to get to more easily.
I think everyone will like to hear that. It's one of the most frequent emails I get is the disaster of traffic on 95. So thank you. But we got a related question, so it feels timely to also ask. Do you think that these parking regs will be onerous either on existing communities, renters, developers, and then also is there a cost benefit to requiring less parking? And I don't know if that's for Tom or if that's for
We
Emmeline.
probably both have stuff to say, but you can.
I mean, the one thing that I will say is that what the legislation does is it says that the town can't deny a project based on the parking. Can't require parking for units under 16, for example. That doesn't mean that developers are not going to build parking spaces, especially if they want to adequately market, their projects. Generally speaking, I mean, when we have folks who build single family homes in our community, I'm sure it would be very cheap for them to build it without garages, but they all build with garages, right? So I think that the development community knows what the market needs in terms of the product that they're trying to sell. And so I really don't have as many fears about projects not being built with appropriate parking attached to it, even if we can't regulate for those 16 units and below. That's just from what I see from projects that are actually being constructed.
Yeah, it's not a hypothetical. I mean, we've had projects that have come before the commission where I've asked the applicant to reduce the amount of parking because they're providing more than is required. And in some cases, in many parts of town, I think we're overparked, right? I think I always, Emmeline is probably sick of hearing me talk about this, but I always talk about what I still call the Bob's Shopping Center, which is such a visible, important gateway to our downtown. And what do you see when you enter our downtown from there is a massive sea of asphalt, hundreds of parking spaces, almost all of which are always empty, right? No matter when you pass by. And the shops are set so far back from the sidewalk, it's a terrible use of space, right? And so I think then, and that's just steps away from the core of our downtown where you have the community theater, which could not be built today because of parking requirements, right? So it's a tale of two downtowns. I think we talk a lot about parking, but I think there's a lot of opportunity here to utilize the space that we have much more efficiently and also to allow for higher and better uses of our parcels. And then to the extent we do think it's important to require parking in certain areas, the legislation does allow for exclusion zones. That's probably not the official name of it. It's a long name. 2 zones up to 4% each of the town's area, right? So to the extent we think there are places where it's important to preserve those parking requirements, there is the ability to do that.
Yeah, and I would just, if I could add to that just briefly, to Tom's point on the parking mitigation zones that are included within the bill. To Emmeline's point, that really is only for developments of less than 16 units. So if it's more than 16 units, they can't be built without the town having a say over what the parking requirements are for that parcel. Less than 16, there is no parking requirement, but as Emmeline mentioned, and I've talked to developers, I've talked to all sorts of people, if you want to market something that is not directly next to a train station, you're going to need parking in order to fill that apartment complex, because no one's gonna, if you don't have a car and you can't park anywhere, you're probably not going to look at that apartment if you have to walk 2 miles to get your groceries and walk 2 miles back with them. So I think some of those concerns get teased out in the financial viability of those developments. But as Tom mentioned, it was a big part of the discussions around the drafting of the bill that passed in the special session in November was this parking issue. And there was concerns from many different parts of the state. I talked to chief elected officials from various parts of the state that did have concerns about that less than 16 units. The original bill that was vetoed by the governor actually had less than 24 units. It now moved down to less than 16. But we did see that there are times and places and areas within municipalities where you already have a significant parking issue. And if you had 4 or 5 developments of, let's say, 15 units that was under that 16 threshold, and none of them included parking, you might run into a problem. So the parking mitigation districts or parking mitigation zones was really an effort to try and combat that potential concern at the local level, to give municipalities the ability on their own to define these districts, as Tom mentioned, up to 4% of the existing land area of that town in 2 different distinct districts where less than 16 unit developments can require parking by the town. So there's again opportunities for the municipality within this bill to really take control of what they want to see, how they want to see it, and where they want to see that development.
And the second part was just this: requiring too much parking drive up the cost of development. I think that's also that's why reducing parking requirements actually is impactful, because you're going to lower the cost of housing.
Parking is very expensive.
Yeah.
Surface parking is expensive. When you talk about structured parking, it's significantly more expensive. And when an applicant has to spend that money on parking, that is less opportunity to include affordability among the residential units. It's less money that they're going to spend on perhaps an elevated architectural design, open space, all sorts of other features that also cost money. And there's always going to be trade-offs. And I think so we need to decide what is more important, having all this parking or having some of these other things that I've also heard people say are important considerations.
Thank you for that, because I think people have genuine concerns about how parking impacts the way they interact in our downtown and our communities. And I learned today that all of our commercial zone only makes up 4% of Fairfield's land. And the opt-out of parking, of no parking minimums, is 8%. Just to put it in context, because I think you hear 8%, that sounds like very little land. And then when you think our entire commercial base is only 4%, actually 8% is twice that. So, all right, I'm going to ask one more question, and I think this was a really worthy topic to spend a little more time on, but we're going to try to go a little briefer on Work Live Ride. Work Live Ride is a broad proposal around having development centered around transit-oriented districts. It is an initiative the legislature has discussed at least for four legislative sessions. There has been tremendous public input, back and forth, negotiation, response to community concerns. So I guess maybe Matt and Rebecca, like what exactly is Work Live Ride? And then for Tom and Emmeline, what does that mean for Fairfield? Where do we stand? What does it require of us?
Okay, sure. So as Jen mentioned, Work Live Ride is a bill that has come up in various iterations over the last 4 sessions, maybe even 5. I don't know. It goes back ways. And what it is, it's kind of what I mentioned before is kind of looking at development in an intentional way at the municipal level to kind of try and focus your more dense developments around transit nodes. So Blackrock or Fairfield Blackrock, I keep calling it Fairfield Metro, I can't stop. Fairfield Blackrock Station, the Fairfield Downtown Station. Those are the places that would kind of qualify for transit-oriented development districts. The town has already done some of that work and adopted a transit-oriented overlay around the Blackrock or Fairfield Blackrock Station. So the town has already done some of that. This bill does have specific stipulations in it that if the town decides to opt into this provision, which is not required as part of SB 25 or PA 25-1. So that's one thing I think it's very important that is getting lost a little bit is the Live Work Ride section of the bill that was passed in November is not a requirement on any municipality. You are able to you're able to opt into it if you'd like to, but you don't have to. And that's at the local option. That's up to the discretion of the chief elected official, the Planning and Zoning Commission, Plan Zone Commission, and others within the town. So that's not something that because it's part of the bill doesn't mean you have to do it. There are some incentives for towns to do so that can be worthwhile. And I would say Fairfield has already done a whole lot of work around TOD planning and TOD implementation. So it might be something that the town wants to look at. But again, it's not something that they're required to do as part of this bill.
And I'll just add to that, there are some parameters built into the legislation around what needs to be included, but there's also opportunity for OPM to issue guidance around the TOD districts. And we are specifically charged with developing an exemption process for some of these provisions, especially for those who are coming in with TOD districts that they had adopted prior to this year. And I can only imagine that Fairfield would be a prime candidate to come in for that, for some of the work that already exists in town. And so that's something, there's not a specific timeline on OPM for developing those guidelines. And we do have some other work that is more pressing at the moment. But we do hope to start to work on that this spring.
Is that anything? Yeah, you want to?
I mean, the only thing that I would say is that when you look at the Live, Work, Ride parameters, they require single-family zoning at 4 units per acre. Our residential A zone is already, every residential A zone is 1 single-family home per 9,375 square feet of lot area. We meet that requirement. Requires middle housing as of right. We already have a residential B zone, which allows a duplex if you have a 9,000 square foot lot. Residential C zone, we allow 4plexes on 12,000 square foot lots. And then in our TOD areas, sometimes our density is not prescribed. It's prescribed within the building envelope, right? So as long as the ground floor is commercial, everything up above can be residential. Or, and this is some of the work that we have to do because it doesn't really pencil out for developers. In some of our other commercial districts, we require 50% commercial square footage to 50% residential square footage. Doesn't pencil out. What we have seen over time, and I'll just give you a physical example, in Brickwalk, many of you go to many of the restaurants downtown in Brickwalk. Over time, a lot of the second floor office space in Brickwalk very quietly has converted to residential units. So we see this already as something that's very desirable for the longstanding property owners within town to do. Just to give you an idea as to density that we allow near the Fairfield Blackrock Station, we allow 70 bedrooms per acre. that far exceeds the live, work, ride requirements. So it's, I think for us here in Fairfield, because we have such a strong history of doing the planning work over such a long period of time, we already meet a lot of those metrics that are required by the state law.
I mean, you said it perfectly. I don't have much to add other than I think the opportunity that comes along with this, which is why would we not want to get rewarded with funding, additional funding, new funding? I should be clear because I've seen some confusion about this. New funding that was not previously coming to us that we can receive, that we can access for things that we're largely already doing. I mean, I think it's a great opportunity to at least look into further. Again, not funding that we would be losing, that we're already receiving and would be losing, but new funding that we would be able to unlock simply for doing the things that we're already doing.
That is a perfect segue into the audience questions. And the three of us could probably spend the next actually 3 weeks questioning the wonderful panelists who bring their expertise. We are going to try and rotate between, we have a number of people who are online. So those of you, we're going to get to as many as we can. So we're going to try and do a little bit more of a speed round so that we can answer as many questions that have come. But one of the Zoom questions that came in just follows up on what you were just saying, Tom, is the new bucket of funding. How is that sourced? Is it shifted from other state programs? And how does a town become prioritized and what can it be used for? And I think I'm looking at Rebecca and Matt for this one, or anyone who wants to answer, but I think this would be great for you guys.
So I'll just describe 3 new funding streams, I guess. One is called the Housing Growth Fund, which is a program that OPM has to stand up by July of 2028. The funding source is not yet identified, and I might look down that end of the table on that.
Yeah.
But that is an infrastructure grant program. So it can be wastewater infrastructure, bike, pedestrian, transit infrastructure, anything that's supportive of new housing development. Another funding, not necessarily new, but what in the school construction reimbursement grant program. If you have a housing growth plan or a TOD district or priority housing development zone, or excuse me, a development district with the CMDA, the Connecticut Municipal Development Authority, you are eligible for a 5% increase in your reimbursement rate on school construction projects. And then the third is a Clean Water Fund loan program, but not DEEP's Clean Water Fund loan program, which is very focused on environmental issues. Would be a Clean Water Fund loan program to address wastewater infrastructure, really more focused on development issues. And so where you might have capacity limitations, it's a loan program, again, that OPM is supposed to stand up by 2028.
And I would just add on the funding piece, one of the things that was discussed and kind of negotiated after the initial housing bill was vetoed by the governor in June was one of the provisions in that bill, HB 5002, actually talked about deprioritizing municipalities, kind of penalizing municipalities that didn't do the planning work that was prescribed in that bill. And that was of major concern to many municipalities, I'm sure Fairfield as well, that you would be potentially, and I don't think Fairfield really would have happened to you because you do so much planning work around housing that you probably would not fall into there. But there was concern that, existing funding mechanisms, not that Fairfield can get this because you're too big, but the steep funding and clean water funding and some other funding, brownfields funding, which you have utilized in the past, those would all prioritize certain municipalities that kind of fully fulfilled the requirements of that bill. And there was concerns that, if a town was making efforts but didn't fully satisfy that legislation, that they would now not be able to access funds that, while they might support housing, are not specifically targeted to support housing. And so through the discussion and through the negotiation process, we really tried to focus on, are there mechanisms by which we can use either new funding like the Housing Growth Fund or the new Clean Water Act Clean Water Loan Fund, or existing funding mechanisms that can kind of be used to incentivize municipalities to work towards those affordability and general housing development growth goals. And that's really where I think this bill has done a great job of using funding and incentives to help promote the planning work that will go into kind of focusing on where housing can and should be built at the municipal level.
Awesome. So this next question is a combination of a question from online and here in person. I'm going to combine them together. Part one, is the housing growth plan enforceable? And who's responsible for implementation versus oversight? What systems exist to ensure the bill's proposed goals or intentions are met?
Sure. So again, the housing growth plans, whether local or regionally adopted, actually come to OPM for approval. And there is a annual reporting requirement on municipalities to report on implementation of your plan. And so part of gaining access to this funding is for OPM to be monitoring, how are you doing with implementing this plan? And that will likely factor into the criteria around some of this funding. And so they are intended to be implemented, and that is, I think, very clear when you read through the elements that are included to be required in the plans themselves. OPM, again, is going to be issuing guidance around these, how you're to report on your implementation progress. And we expect, within the year or so, we will be developing that guidance, working closely with the COGS around that guidance.
And I would say it's probably important to note that too, that, much like the POCD, which has a long list of recommendations for the town to consider over a 10-year period, these housing growth plans are going to have similar kind of recommendations for municipalities in order to kind of both comply with the law and create that availability and accessibility to housing. And I think that's one of the things that is important is you don't have to, it's not saying, and the review and the annual reporting doesn't mean you have to take the recommendation and take all 30 of them that are in there and do them in 1 year. You have to be showing a basic good faith effort at the local level that you are taking steps towards implementing those recommendations. So it's not as if you're gonna have a housing growth plan 1 year and then a whole bunch of things are gonna change within the next year. The idea is to take that as a stepwise progression over the course of a number of years. The housing growth plans are a 5-year plan, so they will be done every 5 years so that you can kind of see that 5-year period is what you look to try and take as many of those recommendations as possible, and you probably won't get to all of them in 5 years. It's almost impossible to do so. But you try to take the ones that you think make the most impact and move them forward to show that you are both complying with the law and also making your town a little bit more accessible for folks to be in and live in.
I just want to add to that because I want to call out and shout out to Affordable Housing Committee members, past and present. Fairfield actually does meet its requirements. We do check those boxes. Our very last affordable housing plan, we achieved so many things that were in that plan. We created affordable housing an affordable housing trust fund. We created an affordable housing fee that's applied to developments within town. Even within the most recent adopted affordable housing plan, many of those policy directives ended up within the POCD. I think Bob Ellinger, I hope you don't mind if I give you a shout out. Bob has been studying parking since 2023, right? So, I am very thankful to be the planning director in Fairfield, where we have a lot of folks who really in good faith move forward with some of these directives, because at the end of the day, these directives and these policies and initiatives, they benefit Fairfielders. And that's who they're concerned about when they're doing these affordable housing plans. So I feel like even though it has a new name, again, we've been doing this work with intention here in Fairfield for Fairfielders, for the benefit of Fairfielders. So shout out to our Affordable Housing Committee, because you guys make our job much easier.
Well, thank you, Emmeline, and I would also like to acknowledge our Affordable Housing Chair, Herb Limekuhler, who is here with us and has been doing this work for many, many years. It would not be a housing forum without talking about 830G. So we have a question about 830G. How does House Bill 8002 interact with the existing affordable housing requirements related to specifically the 830G statute? I don't know if maybe one of us should answer that.
Yeah,
I think the reduction of.
Sure.
Piece.
Sure. So there's another optional tool within the law called priority housing development zones. Again, there are parameters around what these zones have to include within them, but they're basically an overlay zone to enable more dense housing. And there are density requirements within the law. The incentive for that optional program is to lower the bar for achieving an 830G moratorium. And so it lowers what are called the housing unit equivalency points that are required to be achieved, or the percentage of affordable housing units that relative to your overall stock that need to be built in order to arrive at a moratorium. That's a key interaction between 830G and here. Matt, did you want to add anything?
I think Tom may want to actually add something.
I think there's just one other thing that had caught my eye, which is there is an opportunity to also earn bonus HUE points, which again are the points that we amass by allowing more affordable housing upon completion of new units. And there's an opportunity to earn bonus points that aren't currently available through the creation of middle housing in areas, as of right, in areas that are currently zoned residential. And so that's another way, that's low density housing and an opportunity we're currently in a moratorium from 830G for the next 3+ years. But once we earn our second moratorium would be 5 years rather than the 4 that we currently have. And so this would be another tool to help us get to that second moratorium faster.
A quick add there, Matt?
Yeah, I was just gonna add that the bill itself, the law itself also creates a housing council. And one of the things that they're gonna be looking at statewide is really digging into the 830G law itself and looking at ways to make it more accessible, easier for towns to comply with, and make it something that I think has the ability to kind of create what was intended when 830G was passed, which is trying to create more affordability without negatively kind of affecting municipalities and making it harder for municipalities to do the work that they're already doing.
830G does not go away with this bill. There have been some changes, but because Fairfield is in the moratorium, that means we've earned enough points to not have 830G apply to us temporarily, as Tom was saying. And during that time, we have the opportunity to do more of this planning, to lengthen that time so that we can basically have the kind of development we are looking for. And that is leading me to the next question, actually, again, two. I'm going to combine these two. This is about just local input and communication. As the bill's implemented and the town plan is created, the housing growth plan, how will Fairfielders remain in the loop? And how will we inform homeowners, and not just homeowners? We also have lots of people who rent. I think we're 25, I don't know, I forget our exact percentage, but it's not a small number here in town of people who also rent. But how can we inform folks about land that's available for building? And so I'm thinking a little bit about that developable land inventory, and how is it that residents tend to only learn about the projects as they're about to be built. So, but some of this is just practical. How do people find out about what's happening at the town planning and zoning? And then maybe, I don't know, Rebecca, if you want to touch base on that inventory, I'll let you guys decide.
So you can sign up to receive all of our agendas. I mean, that's really the best way to know about projects that are coming down the line, as well as right now, we are doing 3 meetings a month, one of which is a planning meeting that is specifically to look at our zoning regulations and revise our zoning regulations in concert with some of the goals that have been identified within the Plan of Conservation and Development. So that's what I would recommend, is you can just go to our website. There's a button that says sign up to find out, information about plan and zoning, and, you would directly get those agendas in your email.
And I think the planning meetings will be really good for folks to to tune into folks who maybe haven't really paid attention to what the Plan and Zoning Commission is doing in the past, perhaps because it really has been focused on specific input on specific projects, right? And so the planning meetings that are brand new, first time we're doing this as a commission, is a good opportunity to listen in on conversations where we're having these sort of higher level conversations about, in broader strokes, what do we think we should be doing as a town? What kind of approaches we want to take? I think that's where we'll be having conversations about what recommendations from the POCD do we want to start looking at and advancing. And so it's a good opportunity to really get input, to get informed, but then also eventually provide input on some of these broader townwide efforts that aren't just about a project that may be next to you, but have townwide ramifications.
And all our meetings are hybrid, so you can attend in person, you can attend remotely.
That's great. So anyone can sign up and receive information, which is great. So this one is about infrastructure, which I think we talked about earlier. How does the bill account, or now law, account for Fairfield's infrastructure capacities like schools, sewer systems, et cetera? And please feel free to talk about the East Trunk Line expansion work if you would like to do so, how much that costs, and the fact that we are accessing state dollars to do so. Not that I was giving a commercial, and a thanks to actually previous administrations who have helped support that funding.
Do you want me to take that?
I would love that.
Okay. Fairfield, like a lot of communities, our infrastructure is aging. We have a lot of maintenance to do. You may see underway right now the East Trunk Line project. That is the main trunk line that leads to our wastewater treatment facility. That is a really important project for the town because 50% of what's presently treated at the plant is what's called inflow and infiltration. We have a separate stormwater system from our sewer system, but yet 50% of what's treated at the plant right now is rainwater that comes in through leaky manholes, leaky pipes, and it's really costing the town quite a bit. This is a project that we have to fix regardless of whether we're looking at redevelopment within our corridors, because frankly, our wastewater treatment plant is not operating at an acceptable capacity because half of what we're treating is not wastewater, it's rainwater. So, there are fixes, and that's just part of being an older community. We have pump stations that were also on our capital improvement list to be replaced because those pump stations are old. We're just an old community, and that just comes with the territory. I know in terms of looking at the schools, we have schools that were all built in the 50s. And so those schools already, unfortunately, those schools as facility buildings, their utility systems are aging out. And so we are going to be looking at a lot of building replacement, just like, unfortunately, when a house gets to be about 100 years old, you got to make a choice, right? Our municipal buildings and a lot of our public infrastructure, it's reaching the same kind of critical point where it requires replacement and upgrade. So having access to additional funds, I think, would be a really important fiscal choice for the town, especially if we've done a lot of planning work, which allows us to gain access to those funds because our regulations already kind of get us most of the way there.
Thank you. And I'm going to let our education chair chime in about schools for a second too.
And it's really more from as a former Board of Ed member and recognizing we have two former Board of Ed chairs in the House. So, and just sort of a thanks to the planning work the Board of Ed has done really for decades so that we don't have a bottleneck of buildings needing to be renovated, but we operate really on like this 20-year planning process with our schools, recognizing the age of our buildings and knowing these are expensive projects. So methodically going sort of one by one and anticipating sort of the capacity standards of a modernized school, what that means. And, we hear a lot about strain on our schools, and we also have had declining enrollment. So I think that's just like a helpful framework as we're thinking through this, and was important, in my opinion, to have the additional reimbursement rate percentage for school projects. But we're not the only community that's going to need to do school work based on growth. And actually, I think we're probably better suited than most because of the planning we've done. But, you know, making sure the community is supported financially for any sort of infrastructure work that does need to happen.
And that's a follow-up, and this would be maybe to you, Rebecca. You know, the question was, does the bill account for that infrastructure capacity? And it makes me think of what you were talking about earlier in terms of the funds. Like, so would you want to kind of underscore anything about that in terms of infrastructure?
Yeah, so part of the requirements of the housing growth plans is to collect some of that information on what are the infrastructure limitations on your goals and aspirations around housing development. And part of the reason to include that is for the state to be better able to prioritize where it invests in those communities that are ready to go with the housing development. They've been proactive with their regulations, but they just had these infrastructure issues. And so I think the hope is that we will be better poised as a state to address some of these needs, not only through the new funding, but also by collecting more information.
Great. And a lot of that data will be available publicly as well. So this is a quick one for you, Matt. What towns are in our COG?
So it is the town of Fairfield, city of Bridgeport, town of Stratford, town of Trumbull, town of Easton, and town of Monroe. So we have 6 municipalities in the Metro COG region. We are the smallest COG in terms of number of towns, but we do have about 28,000 or so people in our region. So what we lack in the number of municipalities, we make up for in total population. So it's an honor to work with all of the 6 municipalities in our region. As I said, kind of in my opening, we have a very good collaborative working relationship with our towns. And we believe this housing bill and the housing growth plans are just another opportunity for the COG to work collaboratively and collectively with our municipalities to help on a regional basis, but also on a local basis, improve the accessibility and affordability of housing in the region.
All right.
I always say the smallest cog, but the best cog. I love our Metro Coggers.
Small but mighty. So the question also asks, what are the penalties for not participating? We all are part of a COG no matter what. I don't know if it may have meant not participating in the housing growth plan.
Probably.
So I don't know if you want to give a quick answer to that.
Kind of, the recently passed legislation kind of took out all the sticks that existed in the bill that was passed in June and vetoed by the governor. So you would not have access to the different funding mechanisms that Rebecca talked about, that Jen and Emmeline talked about, would be very useful for the town of Fairfield. The housing growth fund, which is specifically for the infrastructure, like a trunk line for sewer, like a pump station for sewer, like pedestrian improvements or bike ped improvements to allow for people to not need cars, so we don't have to worry about the traffic quite as much. All that is fundable, but you have to do, based on the law, you have to have an approved housing growth plan and do some other things to have access to those funding. So there's really, the penalties have kind of been taken out, but I believe that the incentives that were included in the bill that was passed in November really make it a no-brainer for any municipality, that you're much better off doing the planning work, identifying where you want to see this housing, where you want to see development, where you want to see redevelopment, where you want to make sure that where you already have units that are deed restricted and count as 830G residences. You know, one of the actions in the housing growth plan that I've discussed with OPM and Rebecca and across the COGS is this bill does not necessarily require you to build everything, but one of the strategies in the housing growth plan could be to preserve your existing affordability stock. So if you have 25 units that in the next 3 years are going to expire out of their 40-year deed restriction, a mechanism by which you can try to re-up that for another 40 years, because that would be a loss of units. And if you preserve them, that is gaining units. So there's a lot of different strategies that can be used. So I really think that the bill that was passed by the legislature in November really provides an opportunity for municipalities. But there are no, as they call them, sticks in terms of non-compliance. I just think that the incentives are too good to pass up at the local level. So why not do the work, especially in Fairfield, as you've heard all evening, that you've already done 90% of it, if not more. So it's not going to take a big lift to move Fairfield into full compliance with everything in this bill. And as you heard from Emmeline, there's a lot, actually, you are over and above a lot of the requirements. So
Thanks, Matt. I'm gonna push this into speed round because we have a few more questions and I want to try and get to as many as we can. Can you guarantee a moratorium on development around the Fairfield station?
Is that something that Fairfielders would want? I mean, I think,
Well, how about a yes or no answer to that one? Can we guarantee a moratorium around development on either of our train stations?
The answer is,
No.
if the answer is a moratorium on all development, the answer is no.
Right, the answer is no, and that is also because we have private property rights and developers. As Mark Barnhart said this morning at our economic development breakfast, he doesn't always get to choose the developers and folks that he's working with. So that's why we have our regulations in place and we work together as a community to decide those locally. How can the POCD, which is the Plan of Conservation and Development, protect neighbors from developers? This one's you, Tom.
Yeah, I mean, so I think the POCD is, we talk about local control as I think folks associate that with protecting folks. And so the POCD, I think, is a document a plan that was adopted by a local body or local plan and zoning commission. And so I think when we talk about whether it's adopting TOD zone districts or adopting a housing growth plan, what goes into those things are going to be informed by the POCD largely. And again, any specific change that we make as a result of those recommendations is going to go through a public review process with a public hearing where folks who feel like they would be negatively impacted will have an opportunity to weigh in and make their voices heard.
So I'm going to share this question and then I think this one came from here and invite the person to come up afterwards because it's not necessarily about the bill, but it is something that I think a lot of people think about. And we talked about parking. So Fairfield is a community with two large universities. The students who each have a car, many of them and visitors at their place of residence are living in two concentrated areas. Does the town have a plan to address street parking in areas with dense student housing? And I think, though this is a specific question, we talked a little bit about that walkability and how we create communities that allow, I think Emmeline spoke about that earlier. But I would invite the person who asked this, if you could maybe come up and talk to Tom and Emmeline afterwards about this one. So we have a few other questions that we also want to get to. We can come back to that if we have time. What are the common critiques or concerns of 8002 and what are the erroneous messages most heard?
I mean, the one I hear most often that's incorrect is referring to a parking ban, which I think we've explained why that's not the case. There's nothing in the legislation that bans parking, but that's something I've heard from multiple folks sort of conflating the elimination of minimum parking requirements with a ban, which again, it's not. And I think, there is some general confusion around the kind of development that this legislation allows and to what extent the public has input. Again, we talk about as of right or summary review, and I think there's a misconception that there is no longer any public input. Again, that goes back to what I was speaking to earlier, where it's really more about shifting where in the process the public input comes into place. It's not an elimination of public input.
Before I let one of the rest of you follow up, that really does answer how does the bill define local input and at what stage does the input meaningfully influence outcomes? We've talked about that a couple times. Does anyone else want to talk about that? Did you?
I would just, I think I've heard from a number of people and I'm sure people have read articles as well, that the bill is a mandate to build a certain number of units. As I mentioned before, the strategies for reaching your affordability goals. First of all, it's not a mandate to build. It's a requirement to plan for and make the conditions available for housing to be built that can satisfy those goals. It's not a mandate to build a certain number of units in a 5-year period. I think that's really important to know. It's basically setting the planning framework for housing to be built where the town and municipality wants to see it built in the form and fashion in which it would like to see it built in specific areas. So I think that's a big one. And the other one is that kind of that the COGs as these amorphous organizations are just going to tell us what we have to do. As I said at the beginning, the COGs are made up by state law. Of the chief elected officials, they are govern everything we do. So the chief elected officials from the 6 municipalities in the MetroCog region constitute the board of directors for MetroCog. We can't do anything without their approval. So we don't work kind of on our own. We work through and with our municipal board members and our municipal staffs to make sure that the work that we are doing is in agreement and in collaboration with our municipal members. We are not out just kind of doing our own work on our own in our own little place and then sending you a number. That's not the case, and that will never be the case.
5 seconds, the other one I would add that I see all the time is going back to the funding piece. Again, I see a lot of folks who are concerned that we are going to lose funding if we don't comply with certain portions of the bill. Again, not accurate. This is new funding, new discretionary funding that we would be able to access.
One I hear, I think most frequently is that the state is telling us how many units we must build. And if we don't meet that one size fits all goal, then we lose our moratorium. Can somebody comment on that?
We're not losing our moratorium. We already gained it.
You got it.
We already got it. And what I will say is that, there are projects that have broken ground that will likely get us to our second moratorium that are breaking ground now, that will be under construction shortly. So we do hope tariffs and pricing, construction pricing, please, that these developers can actually bring some of these projects to fruition. And again, some of them, we have 2 of them that are right, one that's next to Illicit Brewing, one that is hopefully right across from the Alto development, which should be underway, I hope, by spring. And every one of these projects gets us closer to a second moratorium.
And also, one thing I said earlier that there weren't any sticks in this bill. I guess the only kind of stick you could call it would be if a municipality decides not to do a housing growth plan, or they do one that doesn't satisfy the requirements and is not accepted by OPM. You are not allowed, if you don't have a approved housing growth plan, you cannot get a moratorium 830. That's really the only, subsequent. If you already have one, you can't retroactively pull one. But I don't anticipate the town of Fairfield not doing the planning work, but that's really the only stick in this entire legislation is if you don't have a plan, you can't have a future moratorium on 830G until such time that you have an accepted.
And that's not going to happen in the town of Fairfield.
Certainly not.
So a couple other questions. I know we're getting close to time. Do you guys mind saying a couple extra minutes so we can try and get through? This one is actually asking you about us, and we can also answer this as well. But why was House Bill 8002 the chosen approach rather than targeted incentives or voluntary municipal participation? We'd love to hear your thoughts if you want to share them. If not, we can just answer that. Does anyone want to answer that, or you just want us to answer? We're happy to.
I don't want to talk too much, but I think this is incentive oriented, right? I think there are a lot of other, Matt's talked about sticks. There are a lot of sticks that could have been included in this and were included in some past iterations of the bill. And this is an incentive-based approach to encouraging municipalities to create capacity for diverse housing options. I think it could have gone a lot further, and I feel like the approach that was taken was really incentive oriented.
I think sort of at a higher level to the why not just let everybody do their own thing. I think that's the environment we've been living in, and we know we have a critical housing shortage. Our housing prices are as high as they are because we don't have the housing supply, the inventory to meet the demand of people who want to live here. I saw a question recently, like, why is our economy stagnant in Connecticut? Well, the number one reason we hear from our business community is because there's not enough housing for them to bring more employees here. So we can't have a growing economy if we don't have the capacity for more people to come here to work. And so those things are really closely aligned. And so if all of that was happening on its own, we wouldn't need to incentivize each community to plan for some growth because we'd already be doing it. So I think that's sort of my perspective on why this bill was necessary.
I mean, my perspective as someone who voted against some of the earlier versions of housing bills in the last few years is that those all had too many sticks. And why I voted for this one and really like this one is it does give a lot of power to our municipalities to do the type of planning we need to do if we don't want to get run over by developers. So it strikes that balance of allowing for smart growth so our communities can grow and thrive with, the bigger needs of housing. So I think it was the smartest choice to go because we don't have the sticks. We have these it is incentive based and it's to do the smart work we need to be doing.
And I'm going to save my comments for one of the other questions that will tie into this. I'm going to read two of the questions that came from Zoom. We're not going to be able to answer these here today, but I'll give a quick answer. Is there a plan or opportunity for a multi-generational community arts center? That's not something specifically at the moment, but we have a cultural district, designated cultural district, here in town with Fairfield Theater Company and Sacred Heart. And we have the Quick Center, so we're very fortunate in that way. And then another question, help me understand if pocket neighborhoods might be available in Fairfield. And we're going to leave that one for now just because we're getting close on time. And there are two more that I think we want to see if we can get to. And this one I'm just going to read. I think this came from on Zoom as well. So as TPZ approved mixed use and 830G high density developments are currently in litigation, it's clear there's opposition to high density building. It's obvious Fairfield residents do not want high density urban developments. So this question says, can the legislator speak to residents' preferences to keep Fairfield a small town, and if how they will support us? And why are there so many high density developments being approved if there are structural issues, as Emmeline mentioned? What about residents' preferences? So I will start. I actually think some of our panelists might want to address that as well, and I certainly would welcome legislators. I served as the Planning and Development Chair, co-chair, House Chair of the State's Committee on Planning and Development for 4 years. We had one of two 24-hour public hearings in the legislature related to zoning. It was a precursor to this bill, actually a much, I won't say simpler, but it was not nearly as controversial. I will say, I'm just going to use this as an example. Last night, my phone updated the software and it changed the whole look and feel of my phone. And you know what? It was 2 nights ago. It just ruined my day yesterday because I wasn't used to it. I couldn't find where to send the message and it just threw me off. This is a natural human reaction. Every one of us has difficulty with change, and I am chief among those people. You know, my kids call me the old lady with this, right? That is normal and natural. And I think it is absolutely normal and natural that those of us who love our community, and I love our community, we have the most amazing community with the most amazing neighborhoods, and we want to be able to keep that and preserve that. And actually, Mr. Robb this morning at the economic forecast breakfast talked beautifully about how we preserve our history and who we are as a community. So I acknowledge that. I also acknowledge that there are a lot of quieter voices in the thousands of doors that I've knocked since I was an RTM member who have asked for diversity of housing stock. And they've asked for it in terms of being able to, as a senior who's lost their spouse, who lives in a large home that is now worth a lot of money and they're paying a lot of taxes. They want to stay in the community that they helped to build, but they don't have a choice. to the young people, one of whom is living in my house right now, who we love them, but they don't love living with us, who want to be coming back. Today at the economic breakfast, we saw that Connecticut was at the bottom of the 50 states in terms of the brain drain. We're losing our college students because we don't have places for them to live. The business community has been extremely clear. I use an example of, Dan, the manufacturing roundtable. We had an employer talk to us very specifically about the fact that they have a thriving business, manufacturing business. They are moving those jobs out of state, not because they're going to pay them less in another state. It's because their employees will be able to be housed and to afford housing at less than 30% of their income. You saw the slide that Emmeline put up. The makeup of our families and our demographics, that 65% of Fairfielders are living alone or with one other person. These are the real needs that we're hearing about. And we have to address that need because it's also about affordability and homelessness. Many people are surprised to hear that in the 133rd district, 18% of my district is within Bridgeport, which means the rest is within Fairfield. 40% of the families who live in the 133rd district are what we call Alice families, which means they're struggling to pay their bills. We think of Fairfield as, a lot of people with a lot of money, and there certainly is a lot of wealth. We are now number 9. I think we're tied with Greenwich and Hampden almost, largest in the community. So in the state, excuse me, thank you. The beauty of Fairfield is, as Mark Barnhart said this morning so beautifully, is we have many urban amenities with the small town feel of our neighborhoods. So I think it's about the fact this bill actually helps us address the fact that I don't think any one of us up here just wants high density development. I will speak for myself. I'm not looking for just high density development. Unfortunately, given the planning tools that we have had and the fact that we haven't had a moratorium, we have been on the receiving end of a lot of that. Part of that is because of 830G, but part of it is because of market demand, because Fairfield is the best place to live in the state. So I am done with my soapbox now. I don't know if
I would just add, so it didn't get a lot of fanfare, and as if you are still awake and paying attention, like this is wonky in the weeds stuff, talking about planning and development. And in the 2024 legislative session, we actually passed the greatest reform to 830G since the law's inception. I felt like I was screaming about it from the rooftops into like a black hole, because it is complicated and it didn't eliminate the possibility for these high density projects people don't like. We know, I hear about after traffic on 95, 830G is probably the next thing I hear most frequently about. But what we allowed for is an incentive process for smaller and middle housing projects to be eligible for these housing unit equivalency points. So duplexes, triplexes, quads. If you're in an as of right zone, which we already have a multiple of in Fairfield, that type of housing gets us the points towards our moratorium. And I have heard it loud and clear from the community, also having knocked thousands of doors over the year and received thousands of emails. That's the kind of development people want. They want that smaller scale development that still feels like their neighborhood. And so we did try to incentivize that. We passed that bill, and I know it doesn't get a lot of discussion. Tom mentioned it earlier. I think Tom mentioned it earlier. But we are trying to help incentivize that development, because we do hear the folks who don't want really high density development, especially where they feel like it doesn't belong.
And I hear a lot about wanting to preserve what's great about Fairfield, but we don't ever talk about what we've lost in the last 5 or 10 years. We don't have starter homes in Fairfield. My own community, I live in the Lake Hills neighborhood, was all starter homes 40 years ago. Single family capes, 2-3 bedrooms. They are one by one disappearing and being replaced by multi-million-dollar houses. And not mine, but we are losing those starter homes. Fairfield is not a place where young families can easily establish themselves. And so we need to preserve that. We need to preserve this as a community where somebody can stay and start a life and build a family and be here for generations. And we need to have those opportunities. And part of this bill, which we didn't talk about, is first-time homebuyer opportunities. And there's more about that in the bill. We can talk about that some other time. So we are looking for opportunities for everybody, no matter their life stage, no matter where they are economically, to be part of this community for a long time.
Thank you. Do any of you want to?
I'll just say, I think if our definition of local control begins and ends with having the power to say no, we're going to just continue to get 830G developments. And I think what we saw, folks have seen a lot of these sort of out of place, out of scale 830G applications. Big part of the thing that drove that was getting the moratorium. Everybody, every developer in town and out of town knew that we were about to get our moratorium and raced to get their applications in ahead of the deadline. And so, that was a large backlog. It was an unusual volume of 830G applications, not what we typically see in the course of a year. But I think fact is, I don't think folks think about the economics of these sorts of things because there's no reason to. But affordable housing is very expensive to build and operate. And I don't think there's a developer out there who wants to set aside 30% of a development as below market rate housing. It's very expensive. That's why those are larger buildings, because you need more of the market rate units to cross subsidize the below market rate, right? So you end up, an 830G is always going to be out of scale. And I think the way that we avoid those projects that no one likes isn't by waiting for them to come to us and then trying to justify a rejection. It's by coming up with a proactive vision for what we want to see. Because I think if you give reasonable alternatives, guidelines that say, here's what we want to see as a town, a developer 9 times out of 10 is going to opt to build that instead of an 830G. And I think Emmeline touched on one example of that earlier, where a lot of our post road corridor, the design commercial district zone still has a 50% cap on residential. And what that really means is if you have a 3-story building, you can't have 2 stories as residential, right? You have to have second floor commercial. And there's really just not a demand for second floor office space. And so you're just not tapping into potential. We allow 4-story buildings, but no one is building them because of this antiquated restriction, right? And so some of it is, how do we look at restrictions that just don't make any sense anymore, modernize those and create alternatives to say, oh, along our post road corridor, maybe it's reasonable to see a 2 or 3 floors of residential above ground floor retail, create a more dynamic, walkable space. And a developer, I think that's going to be a much more attractive option to a developer than building an 830G where they have to set aside a third of the project as market rate.
Thank you for talking about getting to yes. And I just want to say, I think we're going to end it there because you've all been wonderful to stay with us an extra 15 minutes. I want to say thank you to everyone who joined us on Zoom, to everyone who took the time to come out here tonight, to my amazing colleagues, and most of all to this panel who has just been very generous, each one of you, Matt, Tom, Emmeline, and Rebecca. We are so grateful for you sharing your expertise and continuing to work together with us as a community. So thank you all very much. Thank you.
This is power. That's